The smoke from burning houses drifts through the narrow streets of Preston on a bitter November afternoon. Behind hastily erected barricades of wagons, furniture, and paving stones, exhausted Jacobite soldiers peer through the acrid haze, watching for the next assault. Their fingers are numb on frozen musket triggers. They have been fighting since 1 o'clock, and the government troops keep coming. At the barricade on Church Street, a Scottish Highlander reloads his musket with practiced efficiency. He has fought at barricades before, but never like this, never with such relentless, methodical pressure. The enemy commander is no aristocratic dilettante playing at war. He is something far more dangerous, a professional. Major General Charles Wills surveys the smoking town from his position near Ribble Bridge. He is 49 years old, a soldier for 26 of those years. He has fought in Ireland, Flanders, Spain, the West Indies, and Sardinia. He has defended fortresses against impossible odds and been captured by the French after one of Britain's worst defeats. Now, commanding 6 regiments in the drizzle of a Lancashire November, he faces the greatest test of his career and Britain's greatest internal threat in a generation. The year is 1715. Britain has been a united kingdom for barely 8 years. The new Hanoverian dynasty sits unsteadily on the throne, whilst across the water in France, the Catholic pretender James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, plots his return. In Scotland, the Earl of Mar has raised 12,000 men for King James. In northern England, another Jacobite army marches south, growing bolder with each unopposed mile. If these forces unite, if they reach London before winter closes the roads, the Protestant succession, the very settlement of 1688, could unravel. But first, they must pass through Preston and Charles Wills. This is the story of how a Cornish farmer's son, a soldier who never commanded a famous victory, never earned a dukedom, never had his portrait painted by the great masters, nevertheless saved a dynasty. It is the story of the last battle fought on English soil, where brutal street fighting decided the fate of a kingdom. It is the story of a man history chose to forget, despite the fact that, on a grey November day in 1715, he may have changed the course of British history. Why do we not know his name? That question will haunt this story as surely as the ghosts of Preston's barricades. Charles Wills was baptized on 23 October 1666 in the parish church of Street Goran, Cornwall. His father, Anthony Wills, farmed his own land, a modest estate that provided respectability but little wealth. The family had been settled in Cornwall since the early 16th century, gentry of the middling sort, neither great landowners nor peasants. By the 1680s, Anthony Wills found his estate encumbered with debts he could not discharge. Land-rich and cash-poor, he faced the gentleman's dilemma, how to provide for 6 sons with more ambition than inheritance. The answer came with the glorious Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange landed at Torbay to seize the throne from the Catholic James II. Anthony Wills saw opportunity where others saw crisis. According to family tradition, he traveled to meet the Prince of Orange and offered what he had to give: 6 sons who could carry swords. William, desperate for loyal English officers to command his expanding army, gave them all commissions. For Charles, aged 22, this was deliverance from the grinding economics of a subdivided estate. The army offered what Cornwall could not, a career built on competence rather than inheritance. In 1689, he received his commission as a subaltern in Colonel Thomas Erla's foot regiment, joining the professional military class that would define his life. His baptism by fire came swiftly. Erla's regiment deployed to Ireland in 1689 as part of William's campaign to crush James II's last stronghold. The Williamite War in Ireland was no gentleman's conflict of maneuver and formal siege. It was savage. Sectarian warfare fought through bogs and hedgerows, where Catholic and Protestant killed with religious fervor. Charles Wills fought at the Boyne on 1 July 1690, where 36,000 men clashed along a river crossing in what would become mythology. He survived, he learned. A year later, at Aughrim, on 12 July 1691, he experienced something far worse. The battle became a slaughter. 7,000 Jacobite soldiers died in a single afternoon as William's professional infantry, Wills amongst them, cut down wave after wave of Irish cavalry and foot. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on Irish soil. For a young officer of 24, it was an education in what disciplined infantry could achieve and what war actually meant. By July 1691, Charles's competence had earned him promotion to captain in the 19th Foot. His brother Richard served alongside him. Survival and merit, these were the twin pillars of advancement for a gentleman without connections. Whilst aristocratic officers purchased their way to high command, men like Wills climbed through blood and campaigning. In 1692, his regiment transferred to Flanders, where King William waged a grinding attritional war against Louis XIV's France. This was warfare on a different scale, entirely vast armies maneuvering across open country, formal sieges of fortress towns, set-piece battles involving tens of thousands. At Steenkerke in August 1692, Wills saw Allied forces butchered in a poorly coordinated attack. At Landen in July 1693, he participated in one of the bloodiest battles of the century, where 20,000 men fell in a single day. The Allies lost. They usually did, facing Marshal Luxembourg, one of the finest commanders of the age. But there was one victory: the Siege of Namur in 1695. For 2 months, Allied forces battered the fortress whilst Wills and his regiment manned the siege trenches, enduring counter-batteries and sorties. When Namur finally fell, it proved that William's armies could beat the French when properly led and supplied. For Charles Wills, it was a masterclass in the painstaking methods of siege warfare knowledge he would later use in reverse, defending rather than attacking fortified positions. By 1694, he had risen to major, by 1697 to lieutenant colonel, but peace brought its own cruelties. The Treaty of Ryswick in September 1697 ended the 9 Years' War, and with it came the inevitable reduction of forces. Wills's regiment disbanded. He went on half pay, a veteran officer of 30 with no war to fight. It must have seemed like the end. He had survived Ireland's bogs and Flanders's killing fields. He had risen as far as competence and modest birth allowed. And now, in peacetime, there was nothing just half pay and the prospect of genteel poverty. But in June 1701, King Charles II of Spain died childless, and Europe went back to war. Charles Wills received appointment to the newly raised 36th Foot. In 1702, his regiment joined an Anglo-Dutch-German expedition to Spain under the Duke of Ormond. They captured Port Street, Mary near Cadiz, then embarked on an altogether stranger venture, a West Indies expedition under Christopher Codrington aimed at seizing French Caribbean islands. In March 1703, they landed on Guadeloupe. What followed was typical of West Indies campaigning: initial success followed by catastrophic disease. Yellow fever and dysentery killed more efficiently than French muskets. Officers and men died in their tents, vomiting black blood. When Codrington himself fell gravely ill in late April, it was Lieutenant Colonel Wills who took command and supervised the evacuation in May. He saved what remained of the expedition, bringing the survivors home to Ireland. It was thankless work, the kind of competent crisis management that wins no glory but marks a man as reliable. That reliability brought opportunity. In 1705, the Earl of Peterborough needed a quartermaster general for his expedition to Spain, someone who could organize supply trains, manage logistics, and solve the 1,000 practical problems that collapse armies before they ever reach battle. He chose Wills. The capture of Barcelona on 4 October 1705 transformed Charles Wills's career. 9 days after the city fell, he received command of a regiment of Marines, soon to become the 30th Foot, and with it, the rank of colonel. He was 39 years old, and finally had his own regiment. More importantly, he had proven himself in the theater that would define the rest of the war: Spain. Over the next 5 years, Charles Wills became an expert in what the British Army did worst: fighting in Spain. The Iberian theater was a nightmare of scorching heat, scarce water, hostile populations, and supply lines that stretched to breaking. At San Esteban de Litera in January 1706, he took command when Major General Conyngham fell mortally wounded, rallying British forces in a sharp, bloody encounter. During the unsuccessful Bourbon siege of Barcelona in April and May 1706, he helped hold the city against vastly superior forces. On 1 January 1707, he became brigadier general. Then came the defense of Lleida. After the disastrous Allied defeat at Almansa in April 1707, Bourbon forces surged through Catalonia. Wills commanded the Allied garrison at Lleida, an exposed fortress deep in hostile territory. For 2 months, he held out against siege, rationing food, rotating his exhausted troops, and maintaining discipline even as hope faded. On 11 November 1707, he finally surrendered on terms, having extracted free passage for his garrison to Allied-held territory. His stubborn resistance had prevented the Bourbons from exploiting Almansa fully and attacking Barcelona whilst it was vulnerable. The Bourbon commander briefly detained him in retaliation for an alleged breach of parole involving a Spanish officer. It was petty and vindictive, but it ended after a few months. Wills returned to England with his reputation enhanced, not diminished. He had shown what British infantry could do when competently led hold impossible positions and extract themselves from disaster. By 1709, Charles Wills was a major general, back in Spain under James Stanhope's command. After victories at Almanar and Saragossa, Allied forces entered Madrid, but they could not hold the interior. Logistics collapsed. Local populations turned hostile. The army retreated. On 8 December 1710, at Brihuega, the Bourbon commander, the Duc de Vendôme, caught Stanhope's rearguard of 3,500 British troops. Wills commanded an infantry brigade. In his subsequent dispatch, Stanhope praised Wills for defending the post, which was attacked with most vigor, and which he as resolutely defended. It was not enough. Surrounded, outnumbered, out of ammunition, the British surrendered. Charles Wills spent the next months as a prisoner of war, enduring what he later described as rigorous imprisonment. It was a bitter end to his Spanish service, captured through no fault of his own, a victim of strategic overreach. But he had earned fresh laurels even in defeat, and when he finally returned to England in 1711, his military reputation remained intact. Yet advancement eluded him. The Tory government that came to power in 1710 wanted peace, not war. Army reductions followed. Stanhope's recommendation that Wills be promoted to lieutenant general failed to receive approval. His brothers lost their commissions. Only Charles's own regiment survived disbandment, converted to infantry and posted to Ireland in 1714. He was 48 years old, a veteran of 5 wars across 4 continents, wounded in body and prospects. It seemed his career would end in obscure Irish garrison duty, a competent general without a great command. And then Queen Anne died. The Protestant succession was an act of political will imposed upon biology. Under the 1701 Act of Settlement, Catholics could not inherit the British throne. When Queen Anne died on 1 August 1714 without surviving issue, the crown passed not to her half-brother, James Francis. Edward Stuart, the son of James II, raised Catholic in French exile, but to her distant German cousin, George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover. On 18 September 1714, George I entered London as king of a realm he barely knew, speaking a language he barely understood. The Tories, who had negotiated peace with France and maintained quiet sympathy for the Stuart cause, lost office immediately. The Whigs, architects of the glorious Revolution and champions of Protestant succession, swept into power under Stanhope and other committed Hanoverians. For officers like Charles Wills, whose loyalty to the new dynasty was unquestioned and whose patron Stanhope now controlled appointments, this was opportunity. But across Britain, thousands disagreed. In Scotland, clan chiefs who resented the 1707 Union saw their chance to restore Scottish independence under a Stuart monarch. In northern England, Catholic gentry and high church Tories, who had never accepted the Revolution settlement, prepared to act. And in France, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, readied himself for the throne he considered rightfully his. On 6 September 1715, John Erskine, the Earl of Mar, raised the Stuart standard at Braemar in Aberdeenshire. Within weeks, 12,000 men rallied to King James. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 had begun. The Whig government acted swiftly, placing reliable officers in key positions. Charles Wills received command of government forces in Chester, with orders to prevent any Jacobite advance from Scotland into England. It was the command he had awaited his entire career: independent authority, strategic importance, and the trust of the crown. He assembled his forces, 6 cavalry regiments and 1 foot regiment. Approximately 3,000 men stood between the Jacobites and the road south to London. In Scotland, Mar's forces achieved nothing decisive. At the Battle of Sheriffmuir on 13 November, 12,000 Jacobites fought 3,500 government troops under the Duke of Argyll to an indecisive draw that was, strategically, a Jacobite defeat. They had failed to break through to the Scottish lowlands. But in England, a different Jacobite force marched with alarming success. Scottish borderers under the Mackintosh of Borlum crossed into Northumberland, joining English Catholic gentry led by the Earl of Derwentwater and Thomas Forster, Member of Parliament for Northumberland. By November, this combined force numbered approximately 4,000 men, 1,600 cavalry, and 2,400 infantry, about half Scottish and half English. Thomas Forster was their commander. Chosen not for military competence, he possessed none, but because he was English and Protestant. The Jacobite leadership knew that English Catholics rallying to a Scottish Catholic pretender would doom the rising. They needed an English Protestant face. Forster provided that and little else. He was a Northumberland squire playing general, and the role fit him poorly. The Jacobites marched south, proclaiming King James in Hexham, then Penrith, then Kendal, then Lancaster. No government forces opposed them. Towns opened their gates. The Jacobite army swelled with volunteers. By 9 November, they reached Preston in Lancashire, a market town of perhaps 5,000 inhabitants, situated on the River Ribble at the intersection of roads leading south to Wigan and Manchester, north to Scotland, and west to the coast. Preston appeared strategically sound. The Ribble formed a defensive line to the south. The town itself could be fortified, and crucially, Preston offered a junction where the Jacobites might await reinforcements from Mar's Scottish army or receive French support through the port of Liverpool. Forster decided to pause there, rest his troops, and consolidate. It was a fatal decision. Charles Wills had been tracking the Jacobite advance from Manchester. On 11 November, he received intelligence that Lieutenant General George Carpenter was force-marching south from Durham with 3 dragoon regiments, approximately 900 cavalry. If Wills could pin the Jacobites at Preston, Carpenter could close the trap from the north. Wills marched from Manchester to Wigan on 11 November, arriving late that evening. His force comprised 6 cavalry regiments under Colonels Pitt, Wynne, Honeywood, Dormer, Munden, and Stanhope, plus Preston's foot regiment, the 26th, later known as the Cameronians. Approximately 3,000 men, with more on the way. At first light on 12 November, Wills advanced towards Preston. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, his forces reached Ribble Bridge, half a mile south of the town. There, his advance guard found approximately 300 Jacobite horse and foot. Upon seeing the government troops, the Jacobites withdrew hastily into Preston. This was the moment. Wills rode forward to conduct a personal reconnaissance. As he approached the town's southern edge, Jacobite muskets crackled from windows and barricades. 2 of his men fell dead. The Jacobites had barricaded Preston's principal streets. Wagons, furniture, cobblestones, and timber blocked Church Street and Friargate, the 2 main approaches from Ribble Bridge into the town center. Behind these improvised fortifications waited Jacobite infantry with loaded muskets. The narrow streets funneled any attack into killing zones where defenders held every advantage. It was exactly the kind of fortified position Wills had defended at Barcelona and Lleida. He knew what disciplined troops behind barricades could achieve. He also knew, with Carpenter approaching from the north, that time was his ally. He could wait, complete the encirclement, and starve them out. Instead, he ordered an immediate assault. Why? The historical record offers no clear answer. Perhaps he feared the Jacobites would escape if given time. Perhaps he wanted the glory of capturing them before Carpenter arrived to share the credit. Perhaps, as a professional soldier, he simply saw troops barricaded in an indefensible town and recognized that shocking them into submission before they could organize proper defenses was sound tactics. Whatever his reasoning, at approximately 2 o'clock on the afternoon of 12 November, 1715, Charles Wills sent Preston's foot the Cameronians forward to storm the barricades. The Cameronians were good troops, raised from Scottish Presbyterians who had fought against Catholic rule. But they charged into a nightmare. Church Street funneled them forward between buildings that housed Jacobite marksmen. The barricade itself bristled with muskets. At close range, perhaps 30 yards, the Jacobite volleys crashed out. Men went down in heaps. Sergeants screamed orders. The Cameronians charged the first barricade, clambered over it, took casualties, and drove the defenders back. Then they hit the second barricade. More volleys. More dead. Lieutenant Colonel Lord Forrester, commanding the Cameronians, pushed his men forward with desperate courage. They took the second barricade. Then fire erupted from houses on both sides, crossfire, devastating and inescapable. The assault broke. The Cameronians fell back, leaving their dead and wounded tangled in the barricades. The Jacobites held. Wills withdrew his infantry and re-evaluated. His cavalry had meanwhile circled the town, enclosing it from all sides. No Jacobite would escape. But direct assault had failed bloodily. He needed a new approach. He ordered houses set alight. If fire spread through Preston's timber-framed buildings, it would force the Jacobites from their barricades or burn them alive. The Jacobites countered by setting fire to houses occupied by government troops. By evening, Preston's southern streets were burning, illuminating the winter darkness with hellish light. Wills ordered his positions lit, as well torches and lanterns to identify friendly troops in the smoke and confusion. It was a mistake. The lights made perfect aiming points for Jacobite snipers in the upper stories of houses. Through the night, government troops crouched in doorways whilst musket balls cracked through the darkness, guided by the very lights meant to protect them. And through that same night, Jacobite morale collapsed. They had repulsed the first attack, yes, but government troops surrounded them. Reinforcements would come. There was no escape. Hundreds of Jacobite soldiers simply left, slipping through gaps in the encirclement, abandoning the cause and their comrades. Morning came cold and gray. At 9 o'clock, General Carpenter arrived from Newcastle with 3 dragoon regiments. Wills deployed them to seal every remaining avenue of escape. Preston was now completely encircled by approximately 4,000 government troops. Inside the town, Thomas Forster convened his officers. Their position was hopeless. Henry Oxburgh, one of his senior subordinates, urged immediate negotiation for surrender on terms parole, perhaps, or prisoner exchange. Forster agreed, but they had not consulted the Scots. When the Scottish contingent learned that their English allies were contemplating surrender, fury erupted. Scottish Highlanders paraded through the streets, threatening violence against anyone who spoke of capitulation. Several people were killed or wounded in the chaos. These men had marched south expecting English Catholics to rise en masse. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a Lancashire market town, betrayed as they saw it by English incompetence. But rage could not change mathematics. At 7 o'clock on the morning of 14 November 1715, Thomas Forster sent an offer to Wills: unconditional surrender. Wills rejected it. He demanded that the Scots surrender as well, on the same terms. Otherwise, the killing would resume. After bitter argument, the Scots agreed. At midday on 14 November, the Jacobite army laid down its arms. 1,468 soldiers became prisoners. 463 of them were English. The rest were Scots, who would never forgive the English for leading them to disaster. Government casualties in the Battle of Preston numbered close to 300 killed and wounded, most of them Cameronians who fell in the first assault. Jacobite casualties were remarkably light, 17 dead. 25 wounded, testament to the strength of their defensive position. But prisoners faced a different kind of death. Among the captured were the Earl of Derwentwater, the Earl of Nithsdale, the Earl of Winton, Viscount Kenmure, and Lord Nairn. All were sentenced to execution for treason under Acts of Attainder. Winton and Nithsdale escaped from the Tower of London in daring fashion. Derwentwater and Kenmure went to the block on Tower Hill. 12 common Jacobite soldiers were hanged on Gallows Hill near Moor Park in Preston itself. Hundreds of others were transported to the American colonies as indentured servants, a slow death of tropical disease and plantation labor, but the strategic impact was immediate and total. The English Jacobite Rising collapsed. Without the Northern Army, Mar's forces in Scotland had no pathway south. When James Francis Edward Stuart finally arrived in Scotland in December 1715, 6 weeks too late, he found a demoralized cause and an exhausted army. By February 1716, the pretender had fled back to France, and the Rising was over. The battle at Sheriffmuir on 13 November, fought the same day Carpenter arrived at Preston, has gone down in Scottish history as an indecisive draw. But Preston decided the war. Charles Wills decided the war. News of Preston's fall reached London on 15 November 1715. Church bells rang throughout the capital. King George I, who had been on the throne barely 15 months, finally breathed easily. The Whig government, which had gambled everything on suppressing the Rising swiftly, celebrated vindication, and Charles Wills received immediate promotion to lieutenant general. But alongside celebration came bitterness. Lieutenant General George Carpenter arrived at Preston 9 hours before the Jacobites surrendered. He was Wills's senior in both rank and social standing, yet the public credited Wills with the victory. The London press called it General Wills's victory at Preston. King George promoted Wills first. Carpenter's role, marching his 3 dragoon regiments 90 miles in 4 days to close the trap, was acknowledged but overshadowed. Carpenter was incandescent. According to contemporary accounts, the two generals had clashed previously in Spain, and old resentments now exploded. Carpenter felt Wills had stolen his glory. Wills believed he had done the fighting whilst Carpenter arrived for the surrender. The matter escalated to near duel. In January 1716, Carpenter sent his second, General Churchill, to challenge Wills to single combat. It took the intervention of the Duke of Marlborough himself, Britain's greatest living soldier, to smooth over the affair. Both men backed down. Both received rewards. Carpenter became Commander-in-Chief, Scotland. Wills retained his promotion and received appointments as Governor of Berwick upon Tweed in 1715, then Portsmouth in 1718. But the rivalry left its mark. In Parliament and in military circles, the question lingered. Who actually won Preston? The answer mattered because victory defined careers, and careers defined rewards. By the time historians wrote their accounts decades later, the ambiguity had hardened into Carpenter receiving equal credit. The rough edges of history had smoothed Wills away. On 22 April 1718, Charles Wills became Lieutenant General of the Ordnance, effectively the Army's chief artillery officer. It was a senior post, prestigious and permanent. He would hold it for 23 years, until his death. On 29 December 1718, he entered Parliament as member for Totnes, a constituency controlled by the Duke of Bolton, a prominent Whig. Wills held that seat continuously until 1741, but he made no mark on Parliament. His name appears in no significant debates. He proposed no legislation. He was a reliable government vote, nothing more. For a man who had saved a dynasty, this parliamentary invisibility seems strange until one remembers that Charles Wills was a professional soldier, not a politician. He sat in Parliament because patronage required it, because senior officers were expected to have seats. But his talents lay elsewhere, and he knew it. On 17 June 1725, King George I made Charles Wills one of the first members of the newly revived Order of the Bath, a chivalric order dormant since the Middle Ages but now restored to reward loyal servants of the Hanoverian regime. It was a signal honor, placing Wills among the most distinguished soldiers and statesmen of the age. Yet the honor he most wanted, the one his contemporaries expected, never came. George I reportedly intended to make Wills a peer, granting him a barony as Baron Preston in recognition of his service. But the king died on 11 June 1727 during a journey to Hanover, and with him died Wills's chance for a title. George II, the new king, felt no such obligation. The 1730s brought further disappointment. In 1726, Wills became colonel of the Grenadier Guards, one of the British Army's most prestigious regiments. But at a review of the Guards in July 1737, Wills and King George II clashed publicly. According to witnesses, the king called Wills a liar over some matter of drill or protocol. Wills, outraged, rode off the field rather than accept the insult. For a man who had spent 48 years in service, who had fought in 5 wars, who had never questioned orders or wavered in loyalty, being called a liar by his king must have been unbearable. He did not resign his commission that would have meant poverty, for his fortune depended on his offices. But the incident damaged any chance of further advancement. In 1739, Charles Wills became General of Infantry, the highest rank he would achieve. He did not reach Field Marshal. He did not receive his barony. He did not enter the pantheon of celebrated commanders. Charles Wills died in London on 25 December 1741, Christmas Day, aged 75. He was buried in Westminster Abbey's north transept, without monument or gravestone. He never married. He left no children. The bulk of his considerable estate went to his aide-de-camp, Robert Rich, and Rich's father, Sir Robert Rich, who served as his executor. His nephew Richard contested the will unsuccessfully. Today, visitors to Westminster Abbey walk over his unmarked grave without knowing it. 300 years after Preston, Britain barely remembers Charles Wills. The battle itself, arguably the last fought on English soil, has faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the more romantic disaster of the 1745 Jacobite Rising and Bonnie Prince Charlie's doomed march south. The 1715 Rising lacks tartans and tragic princes. It ended not in massacre at Culloden but in anticlimax at Preston, where professional soldiers did their job efficiently and the rebels surrendered without apocalyptic bloodshed. And Charles Wills, he has been forgotten because he did not fit the narratives Britain chose to remember. He was not an aristocrat. He won no famous victory that could be painted by great artists or commemorated in stirring ballads. He did not reform the army or write influential treatises. He simply commanded competently at a crucial moment, made the right decisions under pressure, and saved the Protestant succession from internal collapse. Modern military historians, when they notice him at all, acknowledge his competence. The defense of Leyda demonstrated tactical skill. The capture of Preston demonstrated strategic understanding, recognizing that rapid action to trap the Jacobites mattered more than waiting for perfect conditions. But competence does not make legends. Preston mattered because it ended the Jacobite threat in England before it could truly begin. If Forster's army had evaded Wills, if it had marched south and reached the Midlands, if it had linked with Mar's Scottish forces or French landings, the 1715 Rising might have transformed into something far more dangerous. Instead, Wills bottled them up in Preston, and the cause collapsed. In Preston today, a historical trail marks the locations of the barricades on Church Street and Friargate. Blue plaques note where government troops burned houses and where Jacobites made their final stand. But few visitors walk it. Preston is not Culloden. It has no visitor center, no interpretive displays, no gift shop selling replica broadswords. The battle is local memory, not national myth. Perhaps this is fitting. Charles Wills was not a man of myths. He was a professional soldier who climbed from Cornish obscurity to command armies through ability alone. He endured 26 years of campaigning, survived wounds and disease and capture, defended impossible fortifications, and extracted his men from disasters. When Britain needed him, he was there competent, reliable, and utterly without drama. There is a peculiar injustice in how history remembers military figures. Wellington receives monuments. Nelson receives Trafalgar Square. But the men who stop disasters before they become catastrophes, who win unglamorous victories, who serve competently across decades, without a single iconic moment they disappear. Yet, here is what matters. On 12 November 1715, Charles Wills made decisions that changed British history. He advanced rapidly from Manchester. He bottled the Jacobites at Preston before they could escape. He ordered an assault that, whilst costly, panicked the Jacobites and prevented them organizing coherent resistance. He maintained the siege overnight despite casualties and confusion. And when Carpenter arrived, he accepted shared command rather than letting ego compromise the mission. Imagine the alternative. Imagine Forster's army reaching the Midlands, where English Catholics might finally rally. Imagine junction with Mar's Scots. Imagine a winter campaign threatening London itself. Would the Hanoverian regime have survived? Perhaps, but British history would have been fundamentally different, more violent, more sectarian, and far less stable. Charles Wills prevented that, not by genius, not by brilliant tactics, but by professional competence applied at the decisive point. It is the kind of achievement that saves kingdoms and earns footnotes. In the Guards' Chapel at Westminster, where Britain commemorates her military dead, there is no memorial to Charles Wills. In the National Army Museum's permanent collection, his name appears in catalogue entries but not in public displays. In popular history, he does not exist. But on 12 November 1715, in the smoke-filled streets of Preston, Charles Wills earned his place amongst the forgotten men who built Britain not with glory, but with competence, not with genius, but with courage, not with fame, but with duty, faithfully discharged. Perhaps that is legacy enough, and perhaps we owe these forgotten generals something more than footnotes. a recognition that Britain was built not only by Marlboroughs and Nelsons but by the Wills, who simply did what needed doing and asked for nothing more than the privilege of service. Charles Wills, General of Infantry, Lieutenant General of the Ordnance, Knight of the Bath, Privy Councillor, savior of the Hanoverian succession, lies in Westminster Abbey, without monument or stone. But his achievement endures, a kingdom that did not fall, a succession that held, and a battle that ended before it could become a war. He deserves to be remembered.